What I'd like to do in the second half is try and relate all of this to what happened in the 400 years afterwards, after it pretty well became destroyed, and how it explained what ultimately happened in the Land League, the land wars of the late 1900s, and how Ireland, after it got rid of the landlord system and started to come back as an independent republic, how it adopted and reverted back to a good many of the old concepts. So, and it's still happening. But I'd like to sort of give you a mental picture of, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Ireland, but those of you who have, hopefully you've been to East Galway or South Mayo or Roscommon, where there are just, I hesitate to say millions, but certainly tens of thousands of stone walls. And I mean, that's what strikes you about the countryside, is all these incredible stone walls. Remember those? Now, they didn't just appear overnight. So that, they're the living evidence, proof of all the things we've been talking about. Those were how the land was divided up. And each of those fields represent literally millennia of a system of agriculture. And then if you look out from there, and you'll see on the hillsides and in the river valleys and so on, no fences. So now you have an idea of the social system, so that the common land was available to everybody in the Tuatha to graze where he felt. There was no restrictions. Nobody owned any better rights than the next on unenclosed land. and there was a relationship between how much infield, as it was known as, those enclosures. Obviously, they were the most fertile parts of the Tuatha. And of course, that's where they grew their corn, which was largely oats. Irish was famous for oatmeal, still is, wheat and so on. But the oats was its main crop. So one of the ways that a slave could get himself moving up the ladder was if he owned cattle, a cow, if he managed to come into the ownership of a cow, or and so if his owner or his master maybe gave him a cow as a reward for a lot of hard work, and then he grew those cows, he eventually would actually qualify for ownership of land inside in the arable section. You know why? Because he had cow dung. Seriously, believe it or not, your entitlement to land in the infield was directly related to how many cows that you owned, whose droppings that you could actually carry and bring down and fertilize the land, which was incredibly smart, because obviously if you weren't fertilizing the land, you were just depleting it. So there was a direct relationship between the two. So the competition outside on the hills for a herdsman, a successful herdsman, could actually lift himself up relatively quickly by his ability to maintain a herd, which required great skills in husbandry, not least of which was animal health. You know, even as growing up as a kid, I remember farmers who was looked down upon because everything they touched died. Yeah, they just weren't able, whether it was hygiene or what? They weren't able to take care of cattle. Other farmers had what Father Durand would nod their heads and say, "It's got magic hands." That man would go over, and if there was a sick cow or a sick cow, he'd somehow do something. He'd straighten their bones out, or often it was literally chiropractic work. He would just literally get at that thing and straighten out whatever was ailing the animal or the beast. So, animal husbandry was a great art, a great craft, and whether it was with horses or with cattle or with sheep or pigs or whatever. So you can see how the system worked to the community as a whole, to their advantage as a whole. Now, one little thing I want to sort of use as a segue into the more modern times, and that was rent. What was the concept of rent? Obviously, somebody paid somebody something. There was something going on. Well, underlying the whole concept was the concept of fair rent, just as there was great detailed concepts of fair restitution for an injury, whether it was a personal injury or whether it was goods or whatever. So fair rent occupied a tremendous amount of the legal thinking. So needless to say, it resulted in a fair rent, which it did. So that there was a great sense of fairness about it, and everybody accepted it, that it was fair. So for instance, if you had the use of a paddock, let's say, and it was the grass of, say, 10 cows, and you had it for a year or what, so you would, when you moved out, you'd leave a cow behind. So everything was done in kind. You didn't turn up and pay them out in shekels or in marks or whatever, certainly not in coins, because they didn't have that same concept of that top-down control where you had the king's head and all the rest of it. Everything was done by barter system and in kind.
When did the
Kevin,
cash economy come in?
the cash economy? I would say not until the 17th century.
Similar to Scotland.
It came with the English.
Yeah.
It came with the English. Now the Normans tried to introduce it and did to some extent. And they tried very hard, and again they succeeded to a large extent in destroying the old system of grinding. And so you'll see most of what they did was they destroyed the old grindstones. And you'll still see them, most of them are broken. And you'll still see them literally in gaps being used around the country. And occasionally you'll come across one intact, which was probably buried and had survived the industrialization of the Normans. The Normans, what they did was they set up a centralized system on a river. If you notice where all the Norman castles and everything, they're always on a river, and they always are associated with a mill, a water-powered mill, and machinery. And of course the monasteries were European and they were essentially Norman. And you'll see exactly the same thing there. They set up the equivalence of like a mission here in California, self-sustained, and they set up a mill. Now, by breaking all of the old grindstones and requiring the people to literally bring their oats and corn for milling at a price into the mills, they changed the entire economy and did great damage to it. But they didn't really change it totally. They didn't change the ownership. They certainly resulted in more roads and more transportation being required. The opposite to they're trying to go the opposite now, where everything is all self-sustainable, like smart growth and city of villages and all that stuff. Well, the Normans broke that up and tried to regionalize things so that they became great lords. But that's a little aside. But the relationship between the outfield the commons and the infield was very powerful. Now, while everything was paid in kind, and it was not a feudal system in the sense that it was an economic system rather than a power system. Feudal system was more military. It required a payment to a superior lord, to a lord, and then he in turn. And now is a much more hierarchical and a much more stringent system and a much more top-down system. That's not the concept of the fair rent that the Gaels had. It had a very deep basis in economics, so that it was entirely based upon the fair payment for